Shalom, Lord in Christ. We're back again for the second part of history class for New Year's here in America, right? Check out the first part. It's called The Truth About New Year's. We went over some origin stories dating back to Babylon, Egypt, and Rome. Now we're going to be speaking about the slaves' experience here during the New Year's. So if you can, please share the first tab that we got up there. Perfect. Okay, and so we're gonna read about slavery here in America, especially on the New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. We're gonna go over the experience that they had, and even read a small part of one of the chapters of a book called "The Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl," if I'm not mistaken. All right, go ahead.
Americans are likely to think of New Year's Eve and New Year's Day as a time to celebrate the fresh start that a new year represents. But there's also a troubling side to the holiday's history.
So everyone, is having a great time celebrating New Year's Eve and into New Year's Day yesterday. You had the ball drop in New York City. You had thousands and thousands of people all packed into squares like sardines, and everyone's blowing horns and throwing sparklers and confettis in the air to watch the ball drop and counting down. But this wasn't what life was for everyone, especially here in the Americas, specifically in the South. Keep going.
In the years before the Civil War, the first day of the new year was often a heartbreaking one for enslaved people in the United States.
So instead of being a joyous day or celebration for everyone, as you would see looking around the world on New Year's Eve, January 1st, for our ancestors who were slaves, especially in the South, it wasn't a very good day, and it wasn't a day that most looked for or anticipated with joy and celebration and laughter. It was a day of sadness, a day of fright, and we're going to learn about why. Keep going.
In the African American community, New Year's Day used to be widely known as Hiring Day.
As what?
Hiring Day.
So for the African American community, for slaves down in the South, January 1st, New Year's Eve, was known as Hiring Day or
Heartbreak Day.
Heartbreak Day. So for our ancestors who were slaves, this day was called Hiring Day or Heartbreak Day. Now, one may ask, why was it called Hiring Day? Like, what could possibly be happening to slaves that they're being hired, or for it to be called Heartbreak Day? Please keep going.
As the African American abolitionist journalist William Cooper Nell described it, because enslaved people spent New Year's Eve waiting, wondering if their owners were going to rent them out to someone else, thus potentially splitting up their families.
So this was called Hiring Day because for white slave owners, Hiring Day is when the slave owners were able to hire their slaves out for extra income or to pay off debts for services to others. And it was called Heartbreak Day because for slaves, this was a time of the year where families could be broken apart, right? You have a father, mother, 3 kids. On this day, everyone could be sold to different plantations and not see each other for months, years, or ever. Keep going.
The renting out of slave labor was a relatively common practice in the antebellum South and a profitable practice for white slave owners and hirers.
And this was a very common practice. This is something that had been going on for years and years, and the only ones who benefited were the slave owners and those who would hire these slaves to help them produce their crops or work in their factories. Keep going.
Hiring Day was part of the larger economic cycle in which most debts were collected and settled on New Year's Day, says Alexis McCrossan, an expert on the history of New Year's Eve and New Year's Day and a professor of history at Southern Methodist University, who writes about Hiring Day in her forthcoming book, Time's Touchstone, The New Year in American Life.
Go back to StreamYard. Yeah, make our image bigger. Perfect. All right. Keep going.
Some enslaved people were put up for auction that day.
Were what?
were put up for auction that day.
So not only were slaves sold on auctions, right, to anywhere to who, but every year on New Year's Day, even though you've been a slave, then you've been a slave to this one master for X amount of years. On this day, you had the risk of being sold or rented out to someone else, to a new slave owner. Keep going.
Or held under contracts that started in January. These transactions also took place all year long, and contracts could last for different amounts of time. These deals were conducted privately among families, friends, and business contacts, and slaves were handed over in town squares, on courthouse steps, and sometimes simply on the side of the road, according to Divided Mastery, Slave Hiring in the American South by Jonathan D. Martin.
So it didn't matter if your slave master wanted to sell you for New Year's, to hire you out for New Year's, it can happen at any time, any moment, any place. It can happen on the side of the road. It can happen at the courthouse. The exchange can happen in the middle of a public square or at the auction house. Keep going.
Accounts of the cruelty of hiring day come from records left by those who secured their freedom, who described spending the day before January 1st, hoping and praying that their hirers would be humane and that their families could stay together.
Now, if it wasn't for our ancestors who were able to secure their freedom however way possible, chances are we would not have been learning about hiring day or heartbreak day right now today. It was for the bravery and the courage and the perseverance of those who came before us to seek freedom that we learn about many of these atrocities that occurred to our people. And this day was one of those heart-wrenching, heartbreaking events. Keep going.
Of all days in the year, the slaves dread New Year's Day the worst of any, a slave named Lewis Clark said in an 1842 account.
And a former slave, Lewis Clark, said that this day on New Year's Day was the worst day for all slaves. And here we are in 2024 now, descendants of slaves celebrating New Year's Day. Drinking, getting drunk, using drugs, sleeping with whores, being sodomites and engaging all type of sexual deviancy, right? Celebrating New Year's Day when just less than 200 years ago, right? Less than 200 years ago, our ancestors feared this day. They dreaded the coming of the new year because of what would happen. Keep going.
On New Year's Day, we went to the auctioneer's block to be hired to the highest bidder for 1 year, Israel Campbell wrote in a memoir published in 1861 in Philadelphia, in which he describes being hired out 3 times. That's where the saying comes from, that what you do on New Year's Day, you'll be doing all the rest of the year. A former slave known as Sister Harrison said in an interview in 1937.
And that's crazy because when you reflect on that, that pretty much holds true. What you will be doing on New Year's Day is what you will be doing for the rest of the year. That holds true to many of us that are still stuck in this world, right? So if you were smoking weed on New Year's Day, New Year's Eve, chances are you're going to be smoking weed for the rest of the year, right? If you were out there hustling and selling your body, making an OnlyFans account to make money on New Year's Day, the chances are you would still be doing that for the rest of the year. And for our ancestors back then, this was something that they did not look forward to, because if you were sold to be a slave on New Year's Day, you were going to be a slave for the whole year. Keep going.
Harriet Jacobs wrote a particularly detailed account in the Slave's New Year's Day chapter of her 1861 autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl.
Now, we got a little snippet of this book written by Harriet Jacobs. It's called the book is called The Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Let's go to the second tab or the third tab, I believe. We're gonna read that first little page there. That one. Share that. So this is on chapter 3, of incidents in the life of a slave girl. If you can read, please.
Dr. Flint owned a fine residence in town, several farms, and about 50 slaves, besides hiring a number by the year. Hiring day at the South takes place on the 1st of January. On the 2nd, the slaves are expected to go to their new masters.
So she's recording that on hiring day, the first, everyone was being auctioned and sold and contracts were being signed. But on the second day, January 2nd, all the slaves that were bought and sold were expected to go to their new masters or to their new working locations by January 2nd. Keep going.
On a farm, they work until the corn and cotton are laid. They then have 2 holidays. Some masters give them a good dinner under the trees. This over, they work until Christmas Eve.
They what?
They work until Christmas Eve.
So they're working all year long until Christmas Eve. Keep going.
If no heavy charges are meantime brought against them, they are given 4 or 5 holidays, whichever the master or overseer may think proper. Then comes New Year's Eve, and they gather together their little alls, or more properly speaking, their little nothings, and wait anxiously for the dawning of day.
So on Christmas Eve, then they are then given 4 or 5 free days for them to do as they pleased, under observation, of course, right? And then they wait for New Year's Eve, where they have to gather whatever little what they have. Keep going.
At the appointed hour, the grounds are thronged with men, women, and children, waiting like criminals to hear their doom pronounced.
And this is when all the slaves were gathered up. The elderly, the men, the women, the children, the toddlers, all paraded in front of the master, waiting to hear what was going to happen, what was going to be their fate for this new year. Keep going.
The slave is sure to know who is the most humane or cruel master within 40 miles of him. And
this is where they knew who were the most cruelest, who was the most sane, who was the most respectable slave master that they could potentially go to. Keep going.
It is easy to find out on that day who clothes and feeds his slaves well.
You'll be able to see from the other slaves coming into the market to be auctioned off and sold. You can tell who cared and took care of their slaves, and you can tell who just abused and used their slaves and ran them into the ground. Keep going.
For he is surrounded by a crowd begging, "Please, master, hire me this year. I will work very hard, master."
And everyone wanted to work for those slave masters. Everyone begged and pleaded to work for the slave master that would give them the best clothing, the best food, just like we all want the best jobs, right? Who's going to pay us the best? I'm pretty sure no one here wants to work at McDonald's for $15 an hour when they could go work at an office for $25 an hour, right? I'm pretty sure no one wants to go home smelling like bacon grease from Burger King when they can be going home smelling like an air freshener for working in a dentist's office all day, right? Keep going.
If a slave is unwilling to go with his new master, he is whipped or locked up in jail.
He's what?
He is whipped or locked up in jail.
And imagine you being sold or hired to a slave master who was known to be so cruel and devilish to his slaves. You begged and cried not to go. You did everything not to go. But what would happen?
He's whipped or locked up in jail.
You were whipped, beaten, thrown in jail. Keep going.
Until he consents to go and promises not to run away during the year.
Until he agrees to go. Says yes. After he's beaten numerous times, after he's thrown in jail, God knows for how long, or with or without food, he eventually caves in and says, yes, I'll go and I'll be a good slave. Keep going.
Should he chance to change his mind, thinking it justifiable to violate an extorted promise, woe unto him if he is caught.
What?
Woe unto him if he is caught.
If you have been watching ISUPK classes, woe means death and destruction. So death and destruction and misery to whatever slave that thought to go back on their word to be a good slave, run away and get caught. Keep going.
The whip is used till the blood flows at his feet.
The what?
The whip is used till the blood flows at his feet.
That means he was strung up on a tree and whipped until blood just flowed to his feet, from his feet. Keep going.
And his stiffened limbs are put in chains to be dragged in the field for days and days.
That is a brutal imagery that took a lot of courage for a person to write, because this is something that they obviously have seen. Incidents of a life of a slave girl. These are first-hand encounters of what Harriet Jacob saw. We're reading something that happened, and we're reading it from a person who saw it happen. Like we couldn't, like us closing our eyes and hearing it can't even compare to the horror of watching this happen in real time. Just because all because on New Year's Day, slaves were sold to work wherever the new slave master wanted them to work at. And if you refused, you were thrown in jail, you were beaten. If you ran away and got caught, you were beaten. And as your stiff limbs, you can't move them because you're in so much pain. Not only are you chained up, but then you're dragged throughout the field. This is something that you cannot make up. This is something that you can only witness and see and then document. Like without Harriet Jacob writing this down, we would never think to imagine something like this. Quentin Tarantino, no matter how great he is at making movies, he could not have imagined something like this. It is something that had to be witnessed because it was done. You understand? Like everything we see on movies, especially when they come to historical details, is because these were things that actually happened. Someone witnessed it happen, and someone is trying to recreate it. But no one recreated it. We would have never known. If no one wrote it down to share with us, we would have never even thought that something like this was possible. Keep going.
If he lives until the next year, perhaps the same man will hire him again without even giving him an opportunity of going to the hiring ground. After those for hire are disposed of, those for sale are called up.
Read that again.
After those for hire are disposed of, those for sale are called up.
So after those that were being hired, like they're not being sold to a new slave owner, they're just being hired. Like they have a contract that says we're going to use this slave for 4 months. That's how long we're going to hire him for. So after all the slaves that were hired were gone, now all the slaves that are going to be sold for good are now stepping forward onto the auction blocks. This is where you're going to be permanently, this is where you're going to be permanently removed from the rest of your family because you're being sold somewhere else. You're not being hired and then coming back. You're being sold and never to be seen again. Keep going.
Oh, you happy free women, contrast your New Year's Day with that of the poor bondwoman.
Hold on. Read that again.
Oh, you happy free women.
To all the black women and Hispanic women living in New York City, since we're in New York City, right? To all of you living in New York City, all you happy and free women, because black women today they're free. They're strong. They're independent. They're career driven, right? They're single mothers and proud. They're the mother and the father on Father's Day. All you free, single, happy women, keep this in mind.
Contrast your New Year's Day with that of the
Compare your New Year's Day. How did you spend your New Year's Eve? At a club, shaking your behind? At a bar, drinking until you slept with some random guy? At a family's house where you're with the person who sexually violated you when you was younger, right? Where were you, black Hispanic woman, on New Year's Eve? What were you doing, right? You being free, you being able to walk out your house, go as you please, do whatever you want. Compare your New Year's Eve and your New Year's Day to this.
With that of the poor bondwoman.
To that of your slave ancestors. Think about your great grandmother. Think about your great great grandmother. Heck, maybe some of our grandmothers experienced the end of slavery or experienced Jim Crow and the black codes, right? And compare your New Year's Day to your ancestors' New Year's Day. And then think, why are you so happy to celebrate New Year's? When your ancestors were being whipped and caged like animals and beaten and sold and separated from their families forever, here you are on 2023 going to 2024 thinking that is hot flash winter city girl summer, doing whatever you want. Keep going.
With you, it's a pleasant season.
For you, it's a pleasant season. For you, celebrating your New Year's Eve at a bar, at a club, wearing almost no clothing, shaking your behind, sleeping with a random man, increasing your body count, right? It's a happy season for you. Keep going.
And the light of the day is blessed.
And when you wake up the next day, it's a new year. It's a new day, new year, new you. The sun is up. You feel blessed. It's a whole new year, right? Keep going.
Friendly wishes meet you everywhere.
And you get Happy New Year everywhere you go when you walk outside your door. Happy New Year. Happy New Year. Hope you have a happy New Year. How was your New Year's? What'd you do? Keep going.
And gifts are showered upon you.
And, people get gifts because it's so close to Christmas. Here, may this bring you good luck for the new year, right? Keep going.
Even hearts that have been estranged from you soften at this season.
Listen, even your ex-boyfriend who you've been beefing with because he slept with Sharice and Katrina and Maria, even you two come back, you see each other on New Year's Eve at the bar, and you just, rekindle that relationship. Keep going.
And lips that have been silent echo back, I wish you a happy New Year.
And even though you've been beefing with your pops and your cousin, y'all both look at each other, give each other the look, and move your lips to say Happy New Year's. Keep going.
Children bring their little offerings and raise their rosy lips for a caress. They are your own, and no hand but that of death can take them from you.
What?
They are your own, and no hand but death can take them from you.
And you think that nothing can take away your kids but death. Keep going.
But to the slave mother, New Year's Day comes laden with peculiar sorrows.
But to the slave, to your ancestors who were slaves, a very special type of sorrow happens. Keep going.
She sits on her cold cabin floor.
While you're in your nice warm apartment with central heating and cooling, your ancestor was a slave sitting on a cold floor in the middle of winter. Keep going.
Watching the children who may all be torn from her the next morning.
Looking at all the children that she bore. Looking at all the children, her 8-year-old son, her 12-year-old daughter, her 6-year-old daughter, her 15-year-old son, her 2.5-year-old daughter. She's watching them, looking at them, because she knows that they could be taken from her at any given moment. But on this day, while you're throwing shots back of tequila, she's trying to hold back showers of tears. Keep going.
And often does she wish that she and they might die before the day dawns.
And your ancestors would hope that they would all just die instantly instead of having to endure and witness what was about to come on New Year's Day. Keep going.
She may be an ignorant creature, degraded by the system that has brutalized her from childhood, but she has a mother's instincts and is capable of feeling a mother's agonies.
And no matter what she has gone through, no matter what our ancestors went through, our women were still mothers. Keep going.
On one of these sale days, I saw a mother lead 7 children to the auction block.
So she's recounting, witnessing a mom take 7 of her children to the auction block to either be hired off or sold. Keep going.
She knew that some of them would be taken from her, but they took all.
And in her mind, she knew that some of them will be taken. But to her surprise, all her children were taken from her. Keep going.
Salakia. The children were sold to a slave trader, and their mother was bought by a man in her own town. Before night, her children were all far away. She begged the trader to tell her where he intended to take them. This he refused to do. How could he, when he knew he would sell them one by one wherever he could command the highest price.
And here she is, everyone being sold to different parts, including herself. And despite her request to know where her children were, it didn't matter. She was a slave. Your ancestors were slaves. They weren't seen as human beings. Our ancestors were property. And wherever that slave master wanted to sell us, that's where we went. Keep going.
I met that mother in the street.
She what?
I met that mother in the street.
Now, Harriet Jacobs saying that she ended up meeting this mother. She's watching what happened to this mother. She's seeing her children being sold right in front of her. She's witnessing her beg the man who bought her where her children are being taken to, where they're being sold to. And she ends up bumping into her, engaging with her in the middle of the street. Keep going.
And her wild, haggard face lives today in my mind.
And the face on this mother, how she looked, the despair that she was enduring with her children being removed and sold and not knowing where they were going or how they will do or how they will be. She can see that the visual of how she looked was etched in Harriet Jacobs' mind forever. Keep going.
She wrung her hands in anguish and exclaimed, "Gone, all gone."
You know what that means? That means she's doing this. She doesn't know what to do with herself. She's like, she has no power to do anything. So the only thing she can do is touch herself. It's to hurt herself or beat herself, console herself, because she has no power to stop what has happened to her and to her children. Keep going.
Why don't God kill me?
What?
Why don't God kill me?
She's saying, why doesn't God kill me? Listen, God was punishing us and killing us in ways we could never imagine. Being a parent and witnessing your children being sold and stripped from you and shipped to other places for you never to see them again is killing you. That is killing you inside. This mother, she was experiencing exactly what she said. Keep going.
I had no words wherewith to comfort her. Instances of this kind are of daily, yea, of hourly occurrence.
And Harriet Jacob didn't know what to say to comfort this mom who had her children all stripped from her and sold. What could you say to a mother who has no power to stop her children from being sold? What could you say who has no power to help someone whose children are all being sold? There's nothing you could say. Keep going.
Slaveholders have a method peculiar to their institution of getting rid of old slaves whose lives have been worn out in their service. I knew an old woman who for 70 years faithfully served her master. She had become almost helpless from hard labor and disease. Her owners moved to Alabama, and the old black woman was left to be sold to anybody who would give $20 for her.
Insane. After all that service of being a good slave, you're just left behind, withered. Anyone who would give $25 could take you. That's how low her value was, being 70 years old and aged with hard work and sickness. Let's go back to the first one. All right, perfect. All right, so go back. All right, so let's start off. Scroll down, go to the next paragraph. Enslaved people.
Enslaved people who attempt to resist going to their new masters were whipped and thrown in jail until they relented and promised not to run away during the new arrangement.
We just went over that in the actual book. Let's go down to the next paragraph where it says, But
the history of New Year's Day and American slavery is not all horror. The holiday was also associated with freedom.
Let's see what they consider freedom. Keep going.
The federal ban on the transatlantic slave trade went into effect on New Year's Day in 1808.
So read that again.
The federal ban on the transatlantic slave trade went into effect on New Year's Day in 1808, and African American communities did celebrate, but the festivities were short-lived.
So you call that freedom? You call that a celebration for the banning of the transatlantic slave trade in 1808? Don't you know slavery was still going on until 1860s? How is that? How can, so from 1808 to 1863, 1865, that's what, 40 years? Let's just say 40, 50 years. You're celebrating, but for the extra 40, 50 years, slavery is still going on. There's nothing to celebrate. There's no freedom being had for those 40 and 50 years. Keep going.
Different slave trade abolition commemorations took place between 1808 and 1831, but they died out because the domestic slave trade was so vigorous.
What?
But they died out because the domestic slave trade was so vigorous.
Listen, all these celebrations for ending the transatlantic slave trade happened, but it did not stop the slave trade in America. Keep going.
Different slave trade abolition commemorations. Oh, Salakia.
The risk.
The risk of violence was also too great. For example, on New Year's Eve in 1827, in New York City, a white mob attacked African American congregants and vandalized their church.
Keep going.
The holiday became more associated with freedom than slavery when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in Confederate states on New Year's Day in 1863. Slaves went to church to pray and sing on December 31st, 1862, and that's why there are still New Year's Eve prayer services at African American churches nationwide. At such watch night services, congregants continue to pray for more widespread racial equality more than 150 years later.
So after, when Lincoln was signing the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves will go to the church on December 31st, 1962, and pray and worship and conduct service. So that way, the next day, New Year's Eve, that's when the whole slavery was abolished proclamation was put into place. But click on Watch Night. Let's learn a little bit more about Watch Night.
There are no party favors, no paper whistles, no shiny hats for these New Year's celebrants. They won't be greeting the new year with a champagne toast while the ball drops in Times Square. It'll be joyful but sober, especially during those last 10 minutes when the preacher stops preaching, the choir quiets down, and those who are so inclined to get down on their knees and pray. It's called the Watch Night service.
So for the last 10 minutes of December 31st, everyone gets on their knees to pray. Keep going.
A Methodist custom that African Americans adopted and adapted as a spiritual and political ritual during the time of slavery. It continues today around the nation and the Bay Area, with many remembering the most important Watch Night service, that of December 31st, 1862. Skeptical that President Abraham Lincoln would keep his word about emancipation, African Americans, both free and slave, as well as abolitionists, prayed through the night and into the day. Abolitionist and former slave Frederick Douglass stayed at a church in Rochester, New York until 10 p.m. on New Year's Day, awaiting a cable that assured him that the law had been passed.
Right? They all stayed there at church praying as if God was going to hear the prayers of white abolitionists and free slaves and enslaved people, to trust that this white man was going to free slaves, right? They prayed this entire time in the church from December 31st all the way to late in the hours of New Year's Day. Keep going.
Our ancestors always believed that they would someday be free, said Lawrence Van Hook, Laney College adjunct professor of ethnic studies and pastor of Community Christian Church. We believed in our prayer, our watching in anticipation of what God would do.
See, they believed in prayer, right? The scriptures say that God doesn't hear the prayers of sinners. If you're eating pork, you're a sinner. If you're eating raccoon and shellfish, you're a sinner. If you're sleeping with white women, you're a sinner. If you're sleeping with multiple men, you are a sinner. If you are unaliving people unrighteously, you are a sinner. If you're thinking that you joining hand in hand with your oppressor, who just so happens to be your friend and not trying to enslave you, you're out of your mind if you think God is going to wink an eye or bat an eye to help relieve some type of oppression you're under. What happened when the slaves were free? They just faced legal oppression, right? They faced legal oppression by not being able to vote. No, they could vote, right? They're just putting obstacles in their way to vote. Well, yeah, you can vote. You just gotta know how to count to 20 and say your ABCs. Yeah, you can go and vote. You just gotta be able to read this down here, read this portion right here. Yeah, you can vote. You just gotta pay to go into the voting booth, right? They just faced even more oppression by their slave masters. Keep going.
To borrow shamelessly from Dickens, this time of year was the best of times and the worst of times for slaves. Christmas was the best of times because it afforded good eating, less work, and permission to visit distant relatives and friends. New Year's Day, also known as Heartbreak Day, was the worst of times because slave families anticipated being split up as owners would balance their books by auctioning off slaves as well as hogs and horses.
So they were being sold just like horses and pigs were. Keep going.
The institution of slavery first showed signs of cracking with the U.S. ban on slave importation as of 1808. The Civil War brought an official end to the practice with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of September 22, 1862, to be effective as of January 1st, 1863. In 1862, there was a lot of politicking and resistance to Lincoln's plan to free the slaves, said the Reverend Amos Brown of San Francisco's Third Baptist Church. The slaves decided they would gather and watch through the night for the expectation of the dawn of a new day. The January 1st emancipation celebrations began to die out in the North and far West at the beginning of the 20th century, but the custom of watch night persists. For some people, it's the only way to bring in the new year. That's been my party for 61 years, says Pastor Ron Thomas, 61, of the Prayer Tower Church in Oakland. We're praying out the old year, praying in the new. Watch night, like all worship, is sacrifice, says Third Baptist Church Administrator Sharon Haynes. The significance is just thanking God for getting us through. But in those perilous times that gave birth to Watch Night, gathering for prayer was also accompanied by a need to know how to navigate the changes. For each new law passed, from the abolition of the slave trade to the fugitive slave laws, and finally emancipation, the year's start was when they determined a response to the news. This year, the greatest good news to befall the African American community since the end of slavery came early: the election of Barack Obama as President of the United States.
We can stop there. You can remove this. So listen, this was just a little crash course on a slave's experience during New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. Many of us out there in the world were busy celebrating and ushering in this new year with hopes of new beginnings, new changes, new everything. Meanwhile, they don't even consider the pain, the sorrow, the tragic events that occurred to our ancestors on the same day every year since we were slaves here in America. And it's very disrespectful to think that as men and women, descendants of slaves, both Negro and Native Americans, that we don't think to honor our ancestors, and we would rather go out and have a beer, go out and use drugs, go out and party, engage in all type of sexual intercourse and deviancies, that we can't consider or weigh the truth of what days like this represented to our people. And we can't even digest how it has shaped our lives today. I'm Priest Ashagapan of the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge, and today was part 2 of the origins and the truth of New Year's Eve, diving into the slave's experience. And with that, I say shalom.